Beyond Science, Conversations with Arthur M. Young. Interviewer Charles Fauvre discusses issues of science and consciousness with Arthur Young, honored inventor of the Bell helicopter, philosopher, and author of the Reflexive Universe. Today, Believing the Unbelievable, Young's story of his exposure to the psychic world.
Hello. Arthur, I'd like to ask you if there was ever a period in your life when you doubted the existence of psychic phenomena.
I wasn't presented with the question, really. I can't recall that I had occasion to either doubt or accept. I remember the one I remember now was at a football game with friends of my wife's who were Yale. I mean, he was a Yale man, so I was on the Yale side. Mm-hmm. That was wrong because I was supposed to be a Princeton man. Mm-hmm. But I don't like football anyway, so I was doubly out of my territory. Mm-hmm. But I found I could predict the goals. Mm-hmm. I think it was related to the fact I was so uncomfortable. Yeah. But I didn't doubt that, or I didn't, one thing or another. It was just like winds blowing or something. I mean, there's something.
I often have that experience at football games, and my experience is that it's the heightened energy, and mm-hmm. probably taps into an area of collective or another area of time. In any case, we could probably discuss that a little later on if you like, but I wonder then if there was some point in your background where you did encounter elements of parapsychology, and when that might have been.
Well, that did happen, and it happened at a critical time. I'd been, this was when I was at Bell in 1946. I was finishing up the helicopter, but it was very strenuous because I could no longer do things directly myself. I had to work with the corporation. It was very difficult. And I took refuge in studying yoga and doing meditation, what they call meditation now. But the book I had said you have to learn to concentrate, and concentrate on a lotus. Well, I couldn't care less about a lotus, so it was very hard for me to concentrate on a lotus. If it had been a helicopter transmission, I could hold my mind on it very well, but the lotus gave me problems. But I took the precaution or whatever of noting down times when my mind drifted. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to keep your mind on the lotus, and mm-hmm. the best I could do is about 2 or 3 minutes without interruption. But then I'd put down what interrupted me. Well, the remarkable thing was that the things that I put down were things that happened later in the day or the next day. I would have thought they were things from my past. Mm-hmm. Well, that's pretty shattering to me. Mm-hmm. And then I had a real bona fide future dream. I dreamt that at the theater there were stairs in the background and a woman upside down on the stairs. She'd fallen down. It's unusual.
Yes.
But 2 days later, we saw a play with Tallulah Bankhead in which precisely that happened. Mm-hmm. That was the end of the play. She was left lying upside down on the stairs at the back of the theater.
Well, that's a very clear confirmation.
It was a very clear precognitive dream. And I was reading John Donne, Experiment with Time. He talks about precognitive dream. So you could say, well, of course, if you were reading Donne, you would have them by suggestion. But
if you were able.
That does not explain how it's possible to have them, you see. And that was one of my major shaking up that determined me to find out what was the root of it. Well, incidentally, I just got a letter today from de Beauregard, who's a prominent French physicist, taking me to task about his idea on precognition. He says that because the equations of physics are symmetric, they go either way, therefore it's possible to have precognition. I've always thought this was a total misunderstanding of the whole subject since I first heard Feinberg mention it years ago. It's not because time goes either way that you have precognitive dreams. It's because the higher state of consciousness that you can sometimes be in dreams is outside of time. It has nothing to do with time going one way or the other. You're not in time. And now that I've got that off my chest, that's what I say now, but was not able to say it then. But it led to my constructing the cosmology would enable me to say it, you see.
Well, it's quite obvious that, to me, that what you say is true, because your example of a football game, there was tremendous energy there which would alter your state of consciousness or expand it. The same when you concentrated long enough on a very difficult object for you, you were in essence out of your mind and in a different state. And it certainly supports what happened.
Well, I want to go on with these amazing stories, as it were.
Great.
We call them gee whiz because it was, you were constantly stretching your credulity. Well then, soon after that, I left Bell and married my wife, Ruth. And I had become, well, besides being enamored of my wife, I was now fascinated with this strange stuff that I was encountering with yoga and Zen and ESP and the like. And I said that I wanted to go to India to study consciousness or something of the sort. Would she put up with that? And she said she would, anything she didn't mind. So that was it. We were married. But I never did get to India. Rather, we did enroll in a school called the Source Teaching Society, which was a school for self-development, and it had a very remarkable woman teacher. She had studied with Freud and also with Jung. And she parted company with Jung because of a technical difference. To Jung, the sole image for the woman is the animus, and for man, of course, the anima. In other words, it's the reversal of the sex. But according to MBM, the teacher, her name was Mary Benzenberg Mayer, and I tend to refer to her as MBM. For her,
I can see why.
the soul for man or woman was feminine. And they both had these, the spiritual principle was masculine, but the feminine principle was feminine, spirit and soul. They're two different principles. I might mention that that's quite important in this whole study. Soul is the vehicle for experience, the carrier of your memories, your past lives, your longings, all the things that give you motivation. The spirit is a sort of calm witness to that. It is not in matter or time at all.
I see.
Well, at any rate, at this school, part of our learning was to attend a session with the medium. The MBM would get the best mediums you could get hold of, and the whole class would come together, and we were told what to expect. We would be first communicating with our next of kin or ancestors, whatever, people most interested in us on the other side rather than remote beings or gurus. We could do that later. So we were all, I think it was a class of 20, gathered in the dark room, and I was quite surprised. I wasn't surprised by communicating with the dead, because I'd been reading books about it. That was perfectly okay. But most of the communicants from the other side behaved as though they didn't understand it. It was a complete surprise to them. It was as though you were waking someone up out of a deep sleep, and they'd say, "Where am I? What's going on? Why are you here?" They were talking to their relatives or whatever, nieces, grandchildren, but were not aware that they were on the other side and still going. They'd been thinking they were dead.
Interesting.
So that's part of the picture. If you think, if you want to be dead when you're dead, you can be so until you get bored with it, and then you'll gradually perk up and start getting ready for another life. Well, the one that communicated with me was my grandmother. And I said, with sort of respect that I always had for my grandmother, "Oh, you must be able to tell from there better what's going to happen in the near future." And that bothered the teacher. And she chimed in and said, "Oh, no, we know," implying that she knew what was going to happen better than those ghosts over there. My grandmother said quite sharply, "Says you." And this was rather a surprise, because I had this great awe. I held this teacher in great awe. And here was my grandmother talking right back to her.
Was your grandmother's voice audible, or what form?
Yes,
did it
the
take?
voices were very clearly audible. It's what's called a voice medium. That was one of my perplexities at the time. I was getting interested in hi-fi and listening to the best speakers and so on. And I was tremendously impressed because this voice, which changed with each person, was still much better than any electrical, acoustical method that could have been made. That was a physical aspect of it that would impress someone. But I didn't have to be impressed because I was thoroughly convinced that it was a possibility. With another medium where I went myself, the entity on the other side sat on my lap. It was just like of course you could say, well, how do I know it wasn't somebody in the room? So I won't offer that in any way as proof, but I'm pointing out that that was not where my interest lay in getting this absolute proof. Let's see now. I'm getting more into the meaning of these things than into the gee whizzery.
Well, you've worked closely with gifted psychics, have you not?
Yes, I think to get to that, I'd like to tell you about California.
Good.
Because instead of going to India, well, we went to California. It was the place to find the far-out things. And I'd been told by an engineer at Bell about someone in California who could take photographs from a blood spot of a person 1,000, 2,000 miles away. This was so unbelievable that I just about forgot about it.
Pardon me, he could take photographs from a blood spot. I don't
Using a
understand what that
blood
means.
spot as what's called a witness.
All right.
To identify the person. They could take photographs of that person. That's as far as I got from my engineer friend. What she did was to use the blood spot as a method of diagnosis. And it didn't have to be renewed. I mean, if you got a cold or the flu or something, you didn't have to send her another blood spot the way you would with a regular medical doctor. The same blood spot would work, even though it was 20 years old. It kept track of your organism. Well, Drown had found that she could also heal through the blood spot by tuning in these radionics instruments to the right frequency. She could effect a therapy in the same way that she could get a diagnosis. But of course, the most fantastic thing was that she could take photographs of internal organs just by putting the photographic film in the box, which didn't have any lenses, wasn't a camera. It just picked up the information.
Remotely.
Yeah.
As such.
Well, I asked her could she tell me what was wrong with me without telling her that I had a toothache, you see. And we were in the dark room, and she did it and very quickly pulled out the picture, which was a picture of teeth. So being scientific, I said, now could we repeat the experiment? And this time I pressed my tooth so it hurt more. And again, she got teeth, but this time they were enlarged. Now, I've since gotten to know what that is. I can at least pin a name on it. It's thoughtography.
Thoughtography.
Does that help?
All right.
Now you have a name, it's okay.
Yeah.
Oh yes, that's just thoughtography. But it is possible, and there's a very good book on it by a Japanese, the possibility of displaying or precipitating on a photographic film the thoughts of a person. That is probably about as far out as you could go in my thinking about ESP.
But that's in terms of something that's documentable.
Document?
That's documentable. You documented a thought form.
Oh, you're worrying about
film.
documentation again.
Well, I was wondering if you had pursued any scientific documentation of phenomena of that sort.
Well, this brings up a different subject.
Well, and I don't mean to change the...
No, that's very important.
Unless
And
you
it's
had-
just that I've neglected it. I said earlier that I was not particularly bothered about the existence of people on the other side. I took that for granted. But I could say there could be a great deal of fraud or mistakes, but more than likely it's not because the medium is not getting messages. It's because the person on the other side is pretending to be somebody they ain't, taking advantage of this opportunity, a mischievous spook or what have you. Now, that is not the kind of thing that you can document, but I'm saying where the likelihood of error lies. The scientist is more interested in the documentation that would prove the thing to be a bona fide violation of physical law. And I have to confess that I'm not interested in that. First place, I don't see that it is a violation of physical law. And currently with my theory now, it seems more likely than a lot of the things that are occurring in physics.
I see.
So I'm not worried about proving it. It doesn't mean that there can't be fraud, however. Now, let me give you an example of the kind of thing that I think is a better illustration of fraud. I got a telephone call from someone in Montana who was very urgent, very excited. He'd had this vision that Tutankhamun would rise from his tomb and take over the presidency. And he wanted to do something about it, and I must help him, and I could hardly get him shut off. And I finally did, and forgot about it until later. I happened to be in Washington at the time of Carter's inauguration. But what I hadn't gone for the inauguration. I'd gone down to see the display of the Tutankhamun, all these treasures they took out of the tomb. And the people were lined up for miles. You had to make an appointment to go through. And it was literally the case that Tutankhamun was stealing the show from Carter. So there was the source of his vision. It was a bona fide vision, but he had exaggerated it or hadn't stated it correctly. So he saw it that Tutankhamun was taking over the presidency. Well, he was stealing the show, but that kind of thing is very important in the SP, the likeness of the metaphorical likeness. It's much more important than the physical attributes. Another example is one that I like of mentioned right in this room by someone who had been doing a distant viewing. They'd had, you know, the difference between the target picture, I forget what the name of the other one is. The target is what they're trying to transmit, and then the other one is what's received.
I see.
This is in distant viewing.
Okay.
And to put a little more life in it, the target picture was people having intercourse. And it was received as a missile taking off. And she said, of course, this was an error, and went on. And I said, but hey, now, that isn't an error. That's very similar. She said, but you can't recognize metaphorical significance. This is scientific testing. And I said, so much the worse for the scientific testing. That's ridiculous. If you're failing to look at what's important, you're not a scientist.
Just invoked a limitation.
Right. Well, now they have elaborate things with judges doing it. And now not even that is enough. They have to have a list of set questions, like, are there trees? Well, now, what would "are there trees" in the case of this particular example I gave you have to do with it one way or the other? That shows how wrong-headed you can be.
Yes.
Well, this is that. Let me say that this takes me back to what I could see was going on early on. I'm going back to California now. I could see that what was going on was not the tuning of these dials that they talked about in the radionics instrument. What was important was intention. You put your mind, suppose you're in a railroad station and there are 500 people milling around like a Grand Central Station in New York. And yet you spot your friend with just a glimpse of the side of their profile or something, or the color of their hair. That's a remarkable degree of discernment.
Really?
But it's based on your focusing your attention and intending to find that person. Now in distant viewing, they'd give the person the longitude and latitude, and they focus their mind on that point and get the information. Well, so what? So intention has no name in science. There's nothing to describe intention. So you can't have a science of these consciousness phenomena unless you recognize the major factor, which is intention. Now, in the case of the target of two people having intercourse, you have to recognize something else, that there's a level of symbols or a level of metaphor that is not objective. It's more related to our feelings. You could say, well, the feeling of a missile taking off is more similar to the feeling of the target, so that what is transmitted is primarily feelings. And this is actually latent in the word itself. The word telepathy doesn't mean communication at a distance. It means feeling at a distance. And in feelings aren't in space and time. They're in time, but they're not in space.
They're in time, but they're not in space.
And at least that's the way I look at it now.
Let me ask you a question. As I understood it, you were speaking of precognition as being outside of time
Outside of both.
and space.
Time.
But this one is inside of time.
Time, but outside of space.
And could you help me understand the difference there?
Well, time and space can be thought of as vehicles or via or means by which you're able to learn things. I mean, you find out two people can't be in the same place at the same time.
Yeah.
If you don't know that, then you're going to have
Yeah.
automobile collisions and so on. In other words, time and place are a way of identifying things. I say this book, or I might say this book, but the this is just as necessary as the book. The book gives the spatial configuration, which I call
Right.
concept, and the this gives the time I do it.
And it's here now.
Those
Okay.
two factors then identify the object.
Mhm.
Or I'll say I'll meet you at the corner of Ashby and College tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I'm giving you the space and the time. If I didn't give both, it wouldn't be of any effect.
All right.
Now, those two means are the way that the becoming world, which is this world we're in of objects going on at its own time, way we're able to use that to improve the being world of what we are. And we participate in the becoming, but by virtue of these two via, these two means, space and time. Now, insofar as we don't have to be in that world, we can communicate directly. It's certainly not common, but it's getting more common all the time. And I believe it's greatly more common than we realize. We're constantly reading the minds of our friends.
It's a matter then of our sensitivity to what's
Yeah.
actually coming in.
Right.
And do you foresee that man will become more and more sensitive and therefore have more of this sort of experience in the future?
Well, in a sense, these faculties have been blotted out for the very necessary training of ordinary faculties.
And now that we're on
Yeah.
an expansion and an upward evolution of consciousness.
Only insofar as it's no longer necessary to do your homework. But we're doing something in this world that we can't do in heaven. Because in heaven, wherever you want to be, whenever you want to be, your wish is equal to your act. I mean, it's all together. There's no way of making a mistake in heaven. And if there's no way to make a mistake, there's no way to learn anything. So we come down here to make mistakes and learn from them.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, I like that. You worked for a group called the Round Table Foundation at one time, did you not?
Yes, that came after California.
Aha.
And actually, I forgot about Eileen Garrett. That was an important, critical one because it was while I was still at Bell. I met Eileen Garrett through an old friend of mine, one of my best friends. And she gave me a reading. This is a cocktail bar at the Ritz. And from my fountain pen, she gave me the whole morning's conversation I'd had with my friend. This very much impressed me. And a little later, there was a severe helicopter wreck of which I did not know the cause. So I took a piece of the wrecked helicopter to Eileen Garrett. And she felt it. You see, we tried, we couldn't understand what had caused the wreck. And I was deeply concerned about it because at that time I felt responsible. She said there was nothing wrong with the helicopter, that the pilot was having a nervous breakdown and was about to enter a monastery. Well, I didn't want to trouble the deceased pilot's relatives with this business, confirmation. So I forgot about it. But a year later, I happened to be talking to the head of the airport that ran this operation. And he said, by the way, that pilot was having a nervous breakdown, was about to enter a monastery. Almost exactly the same words that Eileen Garrett had said a year before. And it couldn't have been through my reading my mind, because I didn't know it. So that impressed me very much.
You didn't know it, except that you're saying that this phenomena is outside of time, so of course you did know it.
You mean I knew it?
Yes.
I don't see how I could know it.
Well, it may not have been on the conscious level.
Oh, you
But
mean
since it's
that everybody knows everything
Sure.
outside of time?
It's
No,
sort of
I
in-
never said that, but
I
maybe
know you didn't, but that's what it leads me to question if that's not the case.
interesting supposition.
And it's in a sense a holographic construct. It can be looked at that
I
way.
wouldn't buy that, because that would mean there was no point in living if you knew it all already.
In a sense, that's a question which is very provocative, because if we do come from God, and if we are in heaven where we do know it all already,
I think I said in heaven you can't make any mistakes. That's a little different from knowing everything.
I see. I did equate the two.
Well, you see, I don't think we know everything, because it would appear that the real reason for the universe is that God wants to know himself. So if there's something he doesn't know, then surely there's something we don't know, you see. And I think that's what we're in evolution for.
Would you say that we're in this plane to learn about thinking?
Well, thinking, feeling, being, it's all part of this process. Thinking is only one aspect.
One aspect.
Experiencing, but recognizing. Now you could say that when you recognize something, you knew it before. I don't know quite how to handle that. It's very essential, and yet there's something you need to do before you can recognize. So you have to go through the proof, shall we say, of the geometrical theorem, and then you say, aha, I see it. That doesn't mean you knew all of it all along. It means you see your way through it. And I think it's this seeing through that we gain, rather than just collecting information.
Well, thinking would include understanding as
Thinking through would include
understanding.
yes.
It's still a form of intellectual experience of life.
I feel not that the intellect is giving you the forms, but you are providing the light for seeing through the forms.
Indeed, so that when it seems, though, that when we're limited to the physical part of our reality here, when we don't experience phenomena that are external to that we are primarily in a focused thinking state, and that we need to get beyond that in order to have these experiences.
Well, as I put it in the book, if you're going through a mathematical or a geometrical thing, or even any intellectual thing, you're cognizing,
Yes.
cogitating.
Yes.
But that is not what I mean by this other spiritual seeing through, which is
I did not know.
recognition.
Yes.
And the changes the polarity. So instead of it isn't figure, it's see right through all that to the answer. You might not be able to construct all the steps by which you got there, but once you get there, you don't care.
It's a knowing.
Yes, you can.
Direct knowing.
Right.
Yes, okay.
Well,
Is that right or not?
that's an interesting subject, but it's a little
Different.
off my.
Okay.
So I'll get back to Eileen Garrett,
All right.
who introduced me to Andrea Puharich. He was the one that had this round table foundation.
I see.
And at that time, he was drafted to do medical work. So I was to run this round table foundation. And my job was to test sensitives, that is mediums, other kind of sensitives, in and out of a Faraday cage. A Faraday cage is a copper thing, in this case it was about 4 by 4 by 6 or 7 feet, just room enough for 2 people to sit in. And it was charged to about 5,000 volts, sometimes 10,000 volts, depending on the test, and it was supposed to heighten your ESP faculties. And I was to test the mediums in and out. Well, it didn't work. It was much too difficult to repeat the test inside and outside because of the difficulty of repeating these tests. I mean, the first sensitive we got had a message from my mother, and she was with Connie, and this was things, so I knew who Connie was. And,
Is it the presumption that we can control?
and then I
one of the
couldn't
major
say, well,
variables?
all right, now do it over again outside the cage.
Yeah.
She discharged that thing, and then the charge wasn't there anymore. On the other hand, with Frederick Marion, who was a very remarkable psychic, a psychometrist, he could sort a pack of cards face down into red and black and get about 4 or 5 wrong, get only 4 or 5 wrong. In the cage, he got 2 to 3 wrong. So that showed the heightening effect of the cage. That's an order of many billions to get 2 out of 50. You see, you're dealing with 2 to the 50th power. It's a very complicated number, but the chances of getting 2 or 3 out of 52 wrong is astronomical. And, well, I don't know how much more time we have, but I'd like to tell you how I used Marion in a really constructive way.
Good.
To me, it was not a question of proving canny or canty. It was, okay, he can, how well can he do it? What can he do to tell me something I don't know? And one of the things was, that I soon found out, was that it was important for him to deal with the emotional content. Now, when Andrea came back to the round table, he wanted to have some examples of X-ray vision to present to the Pentagon. So he had 5 sealed envelopes in which were words or letters, which Marion was to tell by psychometry what were the letters. And the first day we tried it, he seemed very pained and made these sort of sounds of despair and groaning and looking up to the sky and shaking his hand. And it was as though he was going through some tragic rehearsal. And finally he tried to articulate, prosen. And then he said Prague. And we opened the envelope, and there it was, Prague. This was his native town, and it had endured all kinds of severe tribulations under Hitler. And he was feeling these feelings, but they came before the actual word. And the next day, Andrea said, well, skip all that emotion business and just give us the letters. He couldn't do it at all. He didn't get, I mean, it wasn't just chance. Well, the next lesson was that when he said it didn't matter what language it was in, he would get sealed, I mean, either it didn't matter, sealed envelopes or folded up pieces of paper and so on. Didn't matter to him what language it is, even if he didn't know the language. So I thought, aha, I'll try them on things that I don't understand. And I began on Jung archetypes, you know, the Jungian dream symbols and things like that. And one example will illustrate. I had the word dog on a piece of paper. And he said, this is either a dog or a soldier. Well, if he just said dog, it would have been a failure from my point of view. But when he said soldier, it was a confirmation of what the Jungian interpretation of dog is in a dream. A dog is the disciplined energies. It's because the dog obeys you that it's the disciplined energies, lower energies. Whereas a cat in a dream is an undisciplined lower energy, one you don't have control of.
Yes.
So the soldier was a disciplined energy, you see. So that showed me it was okay to go ahead. And I went to more difficult ones. And one that I often bring up in seminars was the square root of -1. Of course, that's the imaginary number, if you will. But what does it mean? That's what I want.
Yes.
And he struggled with it quite a while and finally said, I remember he was leaning down like this. This is what goes up when it's heavy. And I've often asked people in classes, seminars, think of what goes up when it's heavy. It's perfectly simple, and yet they never can guess it. Can you guess it? What goes up when it's heavy?
No.
Have you weighed yourself lately?
The scale.
Now, of course, this is mixing categories, but that's just what the square root of -1 does.
All right.
See, it's one of the roots of unity. Now, the unity could be the wholeness, and the roots of unity are these separate aspects of wholeness. And one of them is the one you measure. See, the physical object goes down. That's something that's in the physical world. But the weight of the physical object is an intellectual, an intangible. It's not physical. And if you recognize that those two aspects are at right angles to one another, then you can invoke an old trick that's in physics called cross products. That's when you take two terms and mix them around. Like we have heavy goes down, and of course the opposite is light goes up. But if you cross product them, you get heavy goes up and light goes down. Now that creates another axis perpendicular to the first, and it mediates it. Mediating in the sense of controlling and measuring. And that right angle is very important. In fact, I was told by someone that it's the root of the Elohim. Remember, there was Jehovah and Elohim. I don't know what the biblical thing is, but the Elohim, Els are the Elohim. They're right angles, and they were people who could manipulate matter by mind.
Oh.
They were higher beings, I should say, who could manipulate matter by mind.
Step.
Right, and it was through this, they were able to mediate through this right angle. And of course, that's the basis of my geometry of meaning.
Right. Do you have any theories about how parapsychology operates?
Well, I wish they'd go back and read the texts they used to have before they got so scientific about it. What is ordinary psychology? What is ordinary perception? Ordinary perception is much more than sense data. You carry with you a whole lot of memories and a whole lot of concepts which you go about pinning on things like labels, often with the slightest excuse. Now, that body of training and teaching is what really is what counts. You might not need any sensory data except when you get on the wrong bus or something. You fail to look at the sign. But once you're in your right surroundings, you can almost function without sensory input. Now, all that load of stuff is involved, and that's not in the sensory. So when you say extrasensory, the ordinary perception is extrasensory. So if you could begin there, we'd at least have a start. And then we could go to this question that I mentioned earlier, that telepathy is feeling together, feeling. And when the Russians found that they killed the young rabbit and the mother rabbit in the submarine and the mother rabbit in the laboratory felt the pain.
Really?
There's a communication and telepathy, but they happen to be separated in space, but the realm of the feelings is not in space.
All right, so it's the feelings that are the conductor here, or the connector. How come science has such difficulty in making that sort of a
I don't know.
conclusion?
Somebody must have dropped the scientist out of bed at an early age, so he has an extreme apprehension about the concrete. But I don't think it's scientific to go about a study of mind with hammer and chisel.
Oh, that sounds right to me.
I'm very fond of hammers and chisels myself, but you don't use them in the right place.
All in their own space.
This fascination with measurement makes me think of parapsychology as a cargo cult. As a matter of fact, measurement is lots of fun. And I remember when I was at Round Table Foundation, I made up a theme song for the practice. And, nothing could be sweeter but to read it on a meter was the chorus. Well, okay, but you come to the end of your meter, as it were, especially when people can influence the meter. That struck me as very funny, the testing Uri Geller, and there was a magnetic field, particularly subtle kind of magnetic field that he was supposed to influence. Well, the only way they could tell that the magnetic field was influenced by reading it on a meter. But Uri can very easily make the meter read anything he wants anyway, so why would he bother to affect the magnetic field? He could just go directly to the meter.
That's wonderful.
Well, this cargo cult, you know what I mean by cargo cult?
No, I don't.
Well,
I'd like to know.
when the South Sea Islanders saw the Americans land on the islands in the Pacific and make an airstrip, and then this great big airplane would bring in a cargo of goodies, they thought they could do that, you see. And they made a clearing and made sacrifices to the gods, and then hoped that this great thing would come, this great bird would come down and leave a lot of goodies. So hence the name cargo cult. Scientists parapsychologists go through the routine of the scientist and think that they will thereby get the result. Now I've thought of another story. I had a friend, I won't mention his name, but he's dead now, but he was a very good friend of mine and a very scholarly person, and he'd studied with Gurdjieff, and he was very high. But his car, the battery ran down, so he was staying with me, so I took out the battery, which involved taking the nuts off, you see, and then putting the battery in the charger, and then charging the battery. And the next day he was to start off, and I'd assumed he put the battery back, but he came back and he said the car wouldn't work. He put the battery back, but it wouldn't work. So I went over and looked in the car, and he'd put the battery back in, but he hadn't put the cables on. And I said, "What did you do?" And he took the wrench, and he showed me what he did. He went like this with the wrench, but not on the nut. He just did it in the air on both nuts. And I thought, for heaven's sake, has he never... But he was going through the ritual, the right ritual. And he'd been so isolated from machinery, he didn't know that, there was such a thing as a real nut on a real thread. Well, there's another funny story I'd like to tell you, but this is perhaps closer to parapsychology. As I said, Frederick Marion was the most remarkable psychic or sensitive that I've met, but he told about how he worked with Soul. Soul was a British parapsychologist, and he must have never believed in it the way he worked, but at any rate, he did these tests. Well, Marion was required to find which black box a handkerchief had been placed in, and he could do it every time. So Soul began to suspect the audience, who were seated around watching it, of giving him hints. So whoever in the audience was sympathetic to Marion was asked to leave. There's still quite a few people. And Marion still got the right box. So he thought maybe they were unconsciously giving him hints. So they were required to wear gas masks. So all these people sitting around with gas masks. Well, then he thought Marion would be feeling with his feet on the floor where someone had walked to go to the box, you see. So he had to be on a cart wheeled in. So it ended up with Marion on the cart, wheeled in a cabinet with just his head sticking out, and the audience in gas masks all around. And he was to choose the right box. Marion said he could still do it all right, but it took him a while to get used to the conditions, as he put it. Well, there are all kinds of stories. I like to stress the things I was learning from it, which were, first of all, that intention is of primary importance, and second, that feeling is the vehicle for the many of the things that we call ESP, telepathy and things like that. Now, when you get something reading into the future, you're obviously involving precognition. But I'd like to insist again that that's being outside of time. It's not due to the symmetry of time. To try to say that time has symmetry deprives time of its whole meaning. You might as well say you're not talking about time.
See. So let me ask you this. In terms of man's continued evolution, do you expect us to find value and more experience in extrasensory sort of perception, or do you feel it's going to flow more into hard matter as a perception mode and as a way of being?
I'm not happy with the question because it's too local. The ESP is only a minor manifestation. If you were to say it was a form of emotions and values, then I could say that emotion and values were extremely important for our evolution.
All right.
And perhaps more important than intellectual cogitations. But both are necessary, so it's difficult to assign values more to one and to the other. It's like...
In terms of where man is moving through time, which of those directions do you see beginning to
Well, then I
be
have
expanded?
to mention my theory, the process, where you go through these 4 steps and then back up again, so you go through the same ones in the opposite direction on the way up.
Right.
And when you're first born, in a metaphorical sense or in the literal sense, whichever you want, your first manifestation is longing, like the infant longs for the mother's breast. And that's a feeling of wanting, needing something, emotion, value, without being deprived of something it wouldn't have value for you, to see. So the value thing comes next to the beginning, but it's the first manifestation. Then you begin to compare values, and you say you want this more than that, or this is longer than that. But in order to do that, you have to look at the 2 things together, and that means space, the space of simultaneity. And then you've already got away from time in order to make this comparison. You're stepping out of time to make the comparison. And then you're in both together. But when you've learned all about these laws and relationships and measurements, then you can put yourself together. That's what I call organization at the 5th stage, which is what the plants begin to do. It's the beginning of life. After that is accomplished, you would get to the place where you could manipulate values. And that's what the great dramatists do. Play with values just the way a pianist would play on the piano.
I see.
Use these values, not be caught up by them, not be like the infant is trapped in the longing. And if he doesn't get the breast, he yells his head off. That's not the ultimate purpose of value. The ultimate purpose of value is to make things go. Make dramas go. Make the plays the thing, and that kind of thing. Then, having mastered all that, I don't know what comes last, but that's in the realm of the gods and beyond my comprehension. But it would be putting it all together, making worlds, making universes.
Does the concept of love fall into that initial phase of longing?
What a question. I recently discovered the essay of Francis Bacon. This is in a book called The Wisdom of the Ancients. And it deals with interpreting the myths, and it's the best interpretation of old myths that I've ever seen. Well, the myth of Cupid is one that he gives attention to, and the subtitle is The Atom, Cupid or an Atom. The major Cupid was the father of all the gods, and is represented as an infant, and holding an arrow and unclothed. And Bacon describes each of these attributes and says it's the nature, that is a description of the atom. The fundamental atom is represented as unclothed because it's without properties. It's represented as an infant because it's the potential for everything else. It's represented as an archer because the arrow is a symbol for action at a distance. And only through this atom of action does anything happen in the universe of matter. Now, he was anticipating Planck's discovery of the quantum of action, which is action at a distance, light. That's what light is. And the fact that it's a quantum led Eddington to call Planck's constant, or the photon, an atom of action. So it was precisely the same word as Bacon had used 350 years before it was even discovered. See, they were talking about the Democritus atom, but the Democritus atom was a unit of mass, unit of matter. Like if you broke a house down, you would ultimately get it down to bricks, irreducible units. That was an idea that appealed to people very early. But no one except Bacon has realized that it isn't the bricks that's fundamental, it's the action that's fundamental.
Arthur, I really want to thank you for that perception. It's been wonderful for me to be here with you.
Well, I certainly enjoyed talking to you.
Great. Thank you very much.